Welcome to Standard 2B. In this standard, we'll jump right in where you left off in your World 1 history class with a period of history called the Renaissance, as we describe the artistic, literary, and intellectual ideas of that period of history. The essential question that we're trying to answer in the standard is, what were the artistic, literary, and intellectual ideas of the Renaissance? By artistic, we'll be looking at paintings and statues and things of that sort. Literary refers to written works, books, poems, plays, essays, and other things that were put down on paper. Intellectual are things that happen up here. Intellectual are things in the mind, thoughts and new ways of thinking that occurred during this period that we call the Renaissance. Okay, some essential understanding to help us out with this question is to understand that this period, what made this period called the Renaissance different than the period of time before it, was that there were these new intellectual and artistic ideas developing during this time that history considers the beginning of the modern world. You can almost think in terms of your development as a person. This is the transition from a child to an adult. Okay, certain points in your life you look back, especially when you're an old guy like me, and you can say, yeah, I was still really a kid at that stage in my life, and later on, well, I was really more of an adult at that stage. This is really where modern history transitions from being more of a child to being more of an adult. And we see here in this picture, you've probably seen this in various forms. It's often parodied, a sketch called Vitruvian Man by Leonardo da Vinci. This picture kind of captures some of that intellectual and artistic idea, and really the main idea that develops is this idea of humanism. And humanism is a focus on human beings, okay, on people as they are, and their abilities, their talents, and their interests. Prior to the Renaissance, to be honest, you really didn't matter very much as a person. If you were alive prior to the late 14, early 1500s, it didn't really matter to people what you liked to do, what your hobbies were, what your interests were. The reality was life was very short in those days. You weren't around for very long, and the time that you had really belonged to your group. Okay, your religious group, your ethnic group, your racial group, and your interests and your abilities, they were to be used for that particular purpose. Humanism kind of freed people to explore their own individuality. Okay, we can see this reflected in the art. We're looking at a picture here called Madonna and Child, the painting done before the Renaissance. This was done around the year 1295. Madonna and Child, in this case, referring to Mary and Jesus in the Christian religious tradition. And if you take a look at the picture, it's far better than anything I could ever do. You could give me all the paint and all the information to do this, and I couldn't do this good. Speaking just as a work of art, not looking at this for its religious properties, just looking at it as art, it doesn't look that realistic. In particular, the child, the proportions just aren't right. The pose isn't right for a young child. It's not really the way you'd expect a baby to be sitting on its mother's lap. In other words, the purpose of this painting was really to convey the religious power of the people in the picture, not to give any sense of them as humans. Okay, this was more their extraordinary religious power symbolized in this picture. I want you to take a look here at a painting done roughly 200 years later during the Renaissance. This is also a painting with the same title, called Madonna and Child. This was done by the Italian Renaissance painter Raphael. The people you're looking at in the second painting are the same people as in the first painting. Okay, again, Mary and Jesus in the Christian tradition. But you notice the difference if you look at the clothing. If you look at just the poses that they're in, they're much more human looking. Again, taking the religious importance of the painting, putting that aside for a moment, and just looking at it as a work of art, this is how you would expect a human mother and child to look. Again, looking specifically at the child is of human proportions. That's what a baby looks like. You know, that big head, you know, kind of the pudgy baby body, that's all there. This painting isn't trying to convey so much the religious power of Mary and Jesus and Christianity. It's meant to convey their human qualities. Okay, and that's this transition and change that we see during the Renaissance. We see the same idea here in a painting by the northern Renaissance painter Peter Bruegel, who painted Procession to Calvary. This is a very religious painting. Calvary in Christianity is where Jesus was executed. But if you look at this painting, it's almost like a Where's Waldo painting. You're looking very hard to try and find where Jesus is in this painting. We can kind of zoom in here and we see inside the circle, and we see in the detail, we finally see there Jesus about to be executed. But notice this is the moment in Christianity. This is really the main moment here, and yet it's hidden in this sea of human activity. In other words, Bruegel, while painting this important religious event, almost gives more importance to the human activity going around it at the time. Okay, so a couple of things here from the standards that we need to know. First is that the word Renaissance itself, it's actually a French word that means rebirth. Okay, so the Renaissance means the rebirth of classical knowledge. And if you think back to your World I class, classical civilizations, referring here to Greek and Roman knowledge, and as we mentioned, the birth of the modern world. So the Renaissance relied on Roman and Greek knowledge, kind of brushed it off for their time. To give us some examples of this, we see in the art here, the artist Raphael again goes back to ancient Athens in his painting The School of Athens, and paints all the philosophers, mathematicians, scientists that you learned about in your World I class. Here it is 1500, and he's going back over 1,000 years to the ancient Greeks for his inspiration for his painting. Likewise, the Italian Renaissance artist Botticelli dusts off the old Roman gods and goddesses in his painting on the right here, The Birth of Venus. If you remember Venus, the Roman goddess, here is depicted in a painting again over 1,000 years later by Botticelli. So we're revisiting the ancient Greek and Roman learning. I'm sure there's an artistic way of saying it, which I don't know, but we see the return of the large naked statue. The Greeks and Romans were fond of these statues. We see lots of them in Greek and Roman art. They pretty much disappeared, though, before the Renaissance, and the Italian Renaissance artists bring them back. We see example here on the left from the Greeks, and then the famous Italian Renaissance piece, David, by Michelangelo. We also see this pose that's artistically called contrapposta. If you think about the way you stand, okay, you're standing, waiting around in between classes, we typically stand with our weight fully on one leg and our other leg kind of just bearing a little bit of the weight. Statues typically were almost the way soldiers stand at attention. Not very realistic and lifelike. The Renaissance brought back this pose. We also see architecture. The Romans in particular were masters of the domed building and the architecture and engineering required to put a dome on a building. And that knowledge had pretty much been lost until the Renaissance, when they bring it back. You can really think, in other words, of the Renaissance, it's a retro movement. They're looking backwards, dusting off what was cool about the past and redoing it in their own time. We can use a musical example. As students today, you might be familiar with this piece of music by Pitbull and Christina Aguilera. So that might be familiar to your ears. When I hear that, though, as an old guy, I go back much further than that, and I hear what would have been popular when I was elementary school, not high school. Okay, so in other words, we get this idea that the music, in this case, of the past gets dusted off and brought back in our present time. Okay, same thing here. The Renaissance, it begins in Italy. That's an important point to remember. It begins in the Italian city-states, particularly in a city-state called Florence. And from there it spreads to Northern Europe. Florence was ruled by the Medici family, and they used their money and power to make Florence a showcase for their personal and political power. So if you were an artist, this is where you wanted to be during the 14 and 1500s. It begins here in Italy and spreads throughout Northern Europe. Okay, so we have a couple of artists and writers we need to know. We need to know Michelangelo. Okay, Michelangelo, two pieces of art that we should be familiar with were the large sculpture of David and the roof of the Sistine Chapel, the Pope's personal chapel in the Vatican. Michelangelo, again, in painting and sculpting these works, they're very religious works, but he's interested in portraying the human features more so than the sort of supernatural religious features, and that was characteristic of the Renaissance. Leonardo da Vinci, another Renaissance artist we need to be familiar with. You're probably very familiar with Mona Lisa, and also The Last Supper. Once again, two very famous paintings. Last Supper being very religious, but again, the idea that Leonardo wanted to portray not these very important religious figures in their very human condition. Okay, and Mona Lisa not being religious work at all. Okay, as we mentioned at the beginning, not just artistic but literary. We have William Shakespeare, the English playwright, and Shakespeare's works also convey this idea of humanism. Shakespeare wrote plays called sonnets. These were 14-line love poems. He also wrote, and most famously, Romeo and Juliet, among other plays. And again, that sense of humanism. They don't have to be European Christian actors. You could have African American actors, actresses. You could have Asian actors, actresses. I found an example of a Palestinian and Jewish Romeo and Juliet. The story is human. Okay, it can be pretty much anybody portraying these roles. Okay, and then the last figure we need to know here is Erasmus. And Erasmus wrote a book called Praise of Folly. You don't need to know too much about the book except that it really is this idea of humanism. We associate Erasmus with really putting forward this idea of humanism that was the basis of the Renaissance. And that concludes the information we need to know for Standard 2B.